diversification is key. The risks and the impact of those risks are too great on the profitability of an enterprise without diversification in place. So for us, that's expanding the range of cropping systems that are available. And then the common sentiment, possibly as I said before, amongst merchants and food industry is that there's probably a reluctance to change. So it's our responsibility to push that through with evidence-led arguments that showcase the tillage sector can deliver for them. It's not easy, but it's essential we stay going on this.
Last month, Teagasc published a series of roadmaps covering the main production sectors, along with forestry and an overarching food roadmap. The Tillage Roadmap 2030 not only sets out the production and sustainability targets for farmers, but also highlights the broader changes needed to drive the sector forward. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. If you're enjoying the series, we'd really appreciate it if you could follow the podcast and leave a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. Achieving the ambition set out in the Teagasc Tillage Roadmap 2030 won't be without its challenges. However, without clear direction and ambition, it's difficult for any sector to move forward. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by John Spink, Head of the Crops, Environment and Land Use Programme in Teagasc, and Dr Ewen Mullins, the Head of Crop Research in Oak Park, to discuss how this roadmap can help the future direction of the tillage sector. John, I want to come to you first. John, the industry is under quite a lot of pressure in terms of increased costs. As we know, diesel's after going up quite a lot, access to land, etc., which I think are all fairly well acknowledged in the tillage roadmap. You might give us an idea of what's the main purpose of the roadmap and how it can help the industry.
Yeah, Michael, so I suppose the tillage roadmap is one of 8 roadmaps that we produce. And, it's relatively simple. It kind of lays out where we think the sector should be going over the coming years, well, I guess up to 2030, and what we as an organisation are going to do to try and support the sector. And I mean, as you've said, the sector's obviously under huge pressure currently, and you've mentioned access to land and costs of production, but one of the big things obviously is the low price of grain. So I guess as we'll be discussing later on, what can we as an organisation do to try and improve the price that Irish growers are getting for their grain rather than being at the mercy of international markets?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. And Ewan, with that in mind, in terms of, and it does mention in the roadmap a few times, highlighting premium markets as the primary way to increase value. What elements in that are you, I suppose, promoting through research in terms of adding value to those crops?
So the first step, Michael, is to demonstrate to the marketplace that we have added value from Irish crops. So when I say the marketplace, I mean non-feed outlets, so predominantly food industry, processors, etc. So as people will see in the roadmap, roughly less than 15% of the tillage output goes to the food and drinks industry. And previously there have been some perceptions within the food industry that what we produce is fine for feed, but sure, it's inconsistent maybe for food production systems. So we set about addressing that and trying to address it hard. And one example is with the use of our protein crops for food production systems. Our first objective was to demonstrate to the food industry that Irish-derived plant protein is high value, consistent quality, and we can produce it well. So the latter is not an issue. And working with food research teams in Teagasc, we see that the quality and the application potential of the plant protein ticks all the metrics that are needed. So much so that the work in that area now is being expanded into other plant fractionation, so carbohydrate, fiber, phytochemicals, etc. And then the second aspect is to combine the added value potential. And what does that mean? Really, we know, for example, a crop could have a high value ingredient. So it could be oats for a certain beta glucan. It could be a plant protein in faba bean or something else. But also the cropping system itself has the potential to add value to the processor by supporting that company or our initiative to achieve its sustainability goals, and that targets through, for example, the use of AgNav. So combining those two together really elevates the added value potential of what we already produce very well.
And just to give people an idea, when you're talking about in that protein sector, fractionation and I suppose deaggregating what's actually in, say, a bean, for instance, what sort of a product would you see that going into in terms of is it a consumer product or is it more something a bit further away from the consumer?
It can be all of the above. So Basically, the initial work we did on the projects U-Protein and Valpropat was about simple things like about the extraction and the purification of protein from faba bean. So the first step is we know they have good quality protein. They have high concentration, not as high as soya, but that's okay because they have other benefits as well. So aspects of faba bean, the lipid fraction can be used as an emulsifier. The protein, when isolated into a high purity fraction, can go into hundreds and thousands of products. So sports bars, soup ingredients, you name it, anything really where you turn over the back of a wrapper and you'll see protein. And that's really important because a diversified product range is key in terms of adding value to the base ingredient.
Okay. And you mentioned you and also in terms of adding value around the drink sector, and obviously that has been a huge one over the last number of years. Maybe, I suppose, maybe the whiskey thing is kind of stuttering a little bit, but hopefully that will come back. What sort of actions within the roadmap, or maybe practical actions are Teagasc taking to try and help that industry?
So we've been very fortunate because the department have invested heavily with us in the National Centre for Brewing and Distilling at Oak Park. This is managed by Lisa Ryan, and this is a pilot scale hub for malting, brewing, distilling, and dealcoholization. So people have heard about it at the Tillage conference and the open days that we've had, but the centre's uniqueness comes in the fact that it's end to end. So we link cereal agronomy all the way through to malting with pilot brewing, distillation, and as I said, dealcoholization. And then we back that up with laboratory analysis and practical training. So the core mission of the centre is about the greater use of a broader range of Irish cereals in the drinks industry. So we know all about barley, but winter wheat has a role to play, as does rye, and that's where we want to increase the use of cereals in the drinks industry, and that's an important target in the roadmap. For this, we need to push Irish cereals use more in this sector, and the NCBD is the platform to do that because they can demonstrate to the sector, be it SMEs and the larger industries in the drinks industry, that a broader range of Irish cereals and a diversified use of those cereals in different products can play a really important role.
John, can I just bring you in here? Ewan mentioned a bit around, low carbon, and we've been talking a good bit about Irish grain in terms of its low carbon targets. There's other things like cover crops and straw incorporation, that kind of stuff. How within this plan will, Teagasc try and help farmers realize extra income, I suppose, in a general sense, around the value of grain, I suppose, which is the big one people are looking for?
A couple of years ago, we produced a life cycle assessment tool for Irish grain, which was, if you like, calibrated for emissions factors that we would see in Ireland, and that's now built into AgNav. And when we built that LCA and put in data from some representative farms, it showed that Irish grain was relatively low in international terms in terms of its carbon footprint. So obviously now anyone can go into AgNav, any tillage farmer can go into AgNav, they can enter their data in terms of their fertilizer use and their yield and that type of thing, and it will give them the carbon footprint of their grain. And all grain, the vast majority of grain users have targets to reduce what are called their Scope 3 emissions. So that's the carbon embedded in their raw materials. So there should be an advantage for Irish farmers if we can demonstrate that Irish grain is low carbon. Now, whilst I said initially the indications are from that sample of farmers that they're low, what we need is as many tillage farmers as possible in Ireland to put that data in so that we can demonstrate that across the board carbon footprints from Irish grain are low. And there should be a premium for that from the people buying their grain. That should mean that Irish grain is sought after because it's low carbon. Then you asked about cover crops and straw incorporation. That initial data showed that where we allowed for the carbon that's sequestered in the soil through straw incorporation, particularly for oats, that effectively the carbon footprint was close to zero, or in some cases actually below zero. We can't yet account for the carbon sequestered by cover crops in the tool, but there is research which actually Ewan's leading to help us to do that in the future. So there should be a return from the market, and that increased demand for Irish grain should result in an increased price.
Okay, and it's probably short term, John, medium term, or what's the time scope in that, do you think?
I mean, it should be short term. There's a pilot as a result of the Tillage Food Vision, the Department of Agriculture and Board Beer are piloting a tillage sustainability scheme with certainly with one end user, where the idea is that farmers will calculate their carbon footprint as well as their other sustainability measures, and will receive a premium for grain that they supply, which can be demonstrated to be sustainable.
There are a number of challenges, certainly around water quality, biodiversity. How well do you think tillage farmers are positioned to respond to these challenges?
It varies, Michael, I guess, and it'll vary from farm to farm. I think generally speaking, we would see that Irish tillage farmers are sustainable, relatively low impact on the environment, as I said, low greenhouse gas emissions. In terms of water quality, tillage has the lowest N surplus and P surplus, or lowest nutrient surpluses of any of the enterprises, I think, except sheep as a relatively extensive system. The issue in terms of tillage farming is the overwinter period, particularly if you're growing spring crops. And if you have bare ground over winter, then there is a risk of leaching even the relatively low levels of nitrogen that are left in the soil after a crop. That and nitrogen that might mineralize from the soil in the autumn is at risk of leaching. But that's relatively easily solved by ensuring there's a green cover established soon after harvest, whether that be a natural, a good natural regeneration or a planted cover crop. And there are obviously schemes there like the Water EIP and Acres to help growers offset some of the cost of putting those cover crops in.
Sure, and I think tillage farmers are, in fairness to them, very good at taking up on these, especially as you say, the Water EIP last year. Ewan, just in terms of farmers taking up, I suppose, new practices and new research, within the plan, identified research is an area where, we want to try and make strides. What other things is in the program of research that will help to improve the outcomes for farmers over the period of time?
So we would have several, Michael, and they can, I suppose, all be summed up under the banner of de-risking, which really is about its near-term work. So it's focused on reducing the impact of specific threats and protecting that yield potential. So things such as the immediate challenges of disease control. It's a constant, but we've intentionally put a lot of investment into increasing our capacity on disease surveillance. So last year, for example, the reports on chocolate spot, we did the survey, we produced the results and had them out at the Tillage conference. And that will inform people on control for later this year. Yellow rust, obviously. And then on top of the usual suspects that we have a lot of work going on BYDV, septoria and other barley diseases. Integrated weed management is a constant and is going to increase in its importance, and VJ's work on that continues. And then in addition, agronomic practices, nutrient use efficiency, crop establishment. Really, it's about dealing with that season to season problems, whether it's climate induced or biotic, and then supporting yourselves as specialists and the advisors to get those actions out to the sector.
And you mentioned, climate risks. We have lots of certainly price volatility, but climate risks are coming down the road, I suppose. What sort of steps, or in terms of research, Ewan, are you kind of putting in place to try and help mitigate what's going to come along in terms of the climate change risks that are there?
So look, with any risk, as I've said it many times, diversification is key. The risks and the impact of those risks are too great on the profitability of an enterprise without diversification in place. So for us, that's expanding the range of cropping systems that are available. So the Ritchie's work on rye culminated in the rye guide that we launched in January, and that highlights the role rye can play in a rotation. It introduces a good degree of flexibility and a resilient, robust crop, but obviously it's on the assumption there's a market secured for it. So to support that, we're working with stakeholders in the pig industry to highlight how rye can be used in rations with positive outcomes. This isn't new. It's work done in Denmark and Germany. These systems are already in place. So it makes sense. And then the common sentiment, possibly, as I said before, amongst merchants and food industry is that there's probably a reluctance to change. So it's our responsibility to push that through with evidence-led arguments that showcase the tillage sector can deliver for them. It's not easy, but it's essential we stay going on this.
Yeah, lots of challenges there. And speaking even of challenges, integrated pest management is mentioned a good bit.
Yeah.
In terms of where research might help, because we've lots of resistance, weeds, pests, etc., and diseases kind of coming along the line. Where do you think, or where do you see the research coming into its own over the next number of years, probably maybe in terms of plant breeding or that kind of thing, to try and maybe help Ireland specifically, more so maybe than the bigger effort that might happen maybe across the world for the large generic kind of varieties, if you like?
Yeah, so I think IPM, which obviously has been around for decades, um, is going to turn a corner in a positive sense with the developments out of Europe on plant breeding in the last couple of months. So, I mean, robust IPM has to be based on solid varieties with durable resistance. In addition to good performance and quality, etc. So that's resistance to diseases first and foremost. So we already see the benefits of better genetics in barley to BYDV, which is exciting and really important, and not a minute too soon. But we don't have that in the other cereals, winter wheat, oats, and obviously for other diseases in barley. So breeding is essential, but the problem is that it takes too long to breed. And that's where what we call NGTs, or new genomic techniques, such as editing and other techniques, can accelerate this process. So, you can take 3 to 4 years off a breeding cycle. So cereals from 10 down to 6 to 7 years, and potatoes from 13 down to possibly 6, maybe 7 years as well. We're very active in this space. We've established programs in potato and barley, but it's important to point out we're not going to be the sole generator of this material. We'd anticipate this is the starting gun for the breeding industry across Europe, which really needs to accelerate investment and development as quickly as possible for this material that will go into IPM strategies. The key thing is we still need chemistry. On any IPM document, chemistry, the use of PPPs is at the top of the pyramid. And it's really essential that we continue saying this at an EU level, which we do. But with the new breeding material we would hope to see in the years ahead, we think IPM actually will make a really strong contribution. And it's not just for farmers and the environmental potential of it from a sustainability perspective, but it's an absolute necessity because that chemistry toolkit has been decreased over time. So we need robust options, and we see varieties as absolutely essential for that.
John, can I bring you in for one final one here? And you mentioned at the very start there that this tillage roadmap is one of 8. How well do you think the tillage sector is one part of I suppose, an entire agricultural sector out there, and it needs to be stitched in reasonably well to try and get the best out of that, but also to help drive on other enterprises as well. How well do you think that that's stitched into other roadmaps so that we can develop in tandem with everybody else?
So I suppose, Michael, I mean, obviously all farmers are operating a business and, trying to make the best that they can out of their individual business. So economics is very important in that. But I think increasingly, certainly with the development of the tillage part of AgNav, I think there is more of an appreciation across the sector as a whole of the credentials of Irish grain and its low carbon status in comparison to imports that might come into the country, and the potential value that has for other sectors in Ireland. So, I mean, obviously these things don't change overnight, but hopefully, over time, that will be recognised and will increase demand for Irish grain. But one thing I will say is, obviously, we've got to get as much of grain as possible, or the data for as much grain as possible, entered into AgNav. And I'd encourage any farmers to put that data in. There is some concern that people don't want to give the data, and they're saying, I'm not giving the data until someone's going to pay me for it. The data that goes in is the farmer's data. It belongs to the farmer. No one can get it out unless get that farmer's data out unless the farmer gives their express permission. So, they're not giving anything away, and they could fill it in even just for their own interest currently. But the more people that fill it in and broadcast how low carbon their grain is, the faster we'll be able to hopefully get some value out of that for the growers.
John and Ewan, on that very positive note, I'm going to say thanks very much. And look, I suppose collectively we'll all be working hard in this plan to try and bring as much value as we can back to tillage farmers. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
So that's it for this episode, and my thanks to Ewan and John for joining me on the show. The Teagasc Spring Crop Walks continue next week with walks on Monday in Ferns and Timon in Wexford and Thursday in Athy, where we'll be discussing the agronomy of spring crops and in particular how to cope with cost increases and also wild oat herbicide resistance. Other crop walks will take place across the country in the following few days, so keep an eye on teagasc.ie events page and messages from your local advisor. So that's it for today, and as usual, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.